Hi, I'm Kevin, and this is HFX by Bike, a channel all about getting around Halifax by bike. Cities have different names for the idea, but most bike networks have some version of what Halifax calls local street bikeways. Bikeways are often proposed as an alternative to building bike lanes on major roadways, and work by taking low-traffic local streets and changing them to make them more bike-friendly. That sounds great, but they're often very unpopular with safe cycling advocates. Putting the path of travel for bikes on low-traffic side streets keeps bikes away from cars but has the side effect of keeping them away from anywhere worth going. Aside from that, bikeways in Halifax vary widely in terms of their actual implementation. Many are slow and frustrating to use to get around, and so when they're pitched as a cheaper, less politically inflammatory way of adding more bike infrastructure, they're widely panned by the intended users. In today's video, I'm going to outline how I think we can make bikeways a more attractive option, and in a roundabout way, highlight where cities tend to go wrong in building them. In places with more established cycling networks, entire design guides have been written to standardize how bikeways get built. I'm not going to reference any of those here because I want to keep this locally relatable, and because I think what makes a good bikeway can boil down to just a few key concepts: efficiency, exclusivity, and traffic calming. Efficiency is all about how quickly the bikeway can be navigated and how many delays get faced by users. Exclusivity is the idea that if we design a bikeway that's efficient, drivers will understandably want to use it to get around too. This will make it a bad bikeway from a comfort and safety perspective for cyclists. So we have to discourage non-local traffic from the bikeway. Anyone living on the bikeway should still be able to use their car to get around, but the bikeway itself should not be an effective right-of-way for cars. Lastly, whatever cars are on the bikeway should be operating in a safe and responsible manner. There's no way to guarantee this, but traffic calming measures can promote good behavior by making aggressive driving self-defeating. This generally involves reshaping the road surface to include things like speed bumps, narrower lanes, and widened shoulders. To make these ideas a little more quantifiable, I put together a scorecard. Think of it like a more elaborate version of the +1 -2 game I play in my other videos. All of the things that add or subtract points are up on the screen now. Under efficiency, I'll take away points for things like unnecessary stops and unfacilitated crossings at major intersections, and add points for things like how convenient facilitated crossings are. For exclusivity, I'll take away a ton of points for not excluding car traffic at all, and give points based on how many times cars are forced to divert away from the bikeway, with extra points for diversion based on physical barriers instead of signs. And that's because drivers tend to ignore signs whenever it's convenient for them to do so. Lastly, I'll award 1 point for traffic calming for each section between major intersections with at least one element of traffic calming. This means that traffic calming measures will never contribute a large share of the total score, since adding a ton of traffic calming measures to a single section doesn't run up the score at all. This was a conscious choice on my part in designing the scorecard, because I think cities rely a lot on highly visible signs and build-outs to look like something is being done, and those things make calm traffic, but they don't on their own make a good bikeway. Okay, so we've got our concept of what a good bikeway should look like, and a tool to measure it. Let's take a quick look at how the city's bikeways stack up. For fun, I've added in the major roads each of the bikeways is intended to mirror in orange, next to the bikeways in blue. Everything is scaled based on the number of major intersections to make them all comparable. The first thing you may notice is that almost all the roads and bikeways get a negative score. The non-bikeways tend to be very efficient to move through, but obviously don't exclude cars and tend to have pretty minimal traffic calming, if any at all. The bikeways usually exclude cars at least somewhat, and are often heavily traffic calmed, but often inefficient to move through, often losing priority at every local street, or at least every couple of blocks on average, and having to wait for gaps in traffic at every major intersection. So while the bikeways get better scores than the non-bikeways, they're mostly still in the red. Maybe bikeways are just intrinsically bad. I don't think that's the case. As an example, let's try to build a bikeway right now. Suppose there's an ongoing debate about building bike lanes on Connaught Avenue, which runs north-south for about 2.8 kilometers on the peninsula, and the city decided that actually it wants to make a bikeway instead, the West End Bikeway. I've plotted a roughly linear course on the local streets just east of Connaught, running down Connolly, briefly onto Elm, and then down Beach. Adding Connaught and the new bikeway to our new graph scores, and oh boy, this one's going to be rough. It seems like it would be hard to make this a good bikeway, but I think it's actually only going to take a few changes to make it pretty good. First, I'm going to give the bikeway priority over all intersecting local streets. Second, I'm going to add push-button half signals to every major intersection. Each of these intersections already has a push button signal for pedestrians. I'm just going to put a signal where it's convenient for cyclists to access, so there's no real change in how that works. Third, I'm going to add a single physical barrier for cars. It doesn't really matter for the sake of the hypothetical, but for the sake of argument, I'm just going to put it on Almond Street, and it's going to prevent cars from crossing Almond and traversing the entire length of the bikeway. Lastly, I'm just going to apply some more consistent traffic calming throughout in the form of speed bumps on each section of the bikeway. And that's it. That's all the changes. How does that impact the scorecard? Well, with just those changes, the West End is now essentially tied with Vernon as the best bikeway in the city. Yeah, it was that easy. The point of this exercise wasn't to advocate for a West End bikeway, but to show how little it would take to make one, and to make it reasonably well, and hopefully to have those concepts be applied to other bikeways. Part of the recurring issue with some of our bikeways being borderline unusable is how they are conceived of by active transport planners and city governments more generally. Here in Halifax, they're called local street bikeways, and the thinking seems to be that they're local streets that bikes can use. Instead, this needs to shift to recognizing bikeways as being separate from local streets and functioning more as an arterial specific to bikes. The way that I want planners to set up bikeways is to imagine making a collector or arterial road for cars and then limit access to cars. If that's not an option, then you're not really building a bikeway at all. That's it for this week. Let me know if this changed how you think about bikeways, and if there's any bikeways you think these concepts could help improve. As always, thanks for watching, and see you next time.